Hi, everyone. I can see some faces. I can see a lot of people who have decided that they're still going to be wearing sweatpants and not combing their hair, so all of their cameras are off. So applaud all of you brave people who are actually showing your faces. Thank you. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Marcia. Thank you, iPhone. I'm assuming that's not your actual name, iPhone, but thank you for showing up there. I'd like to welcome our special guest, Fuji. Fuji is, I'm just kidding. Fuji's a member of the brokerage here in Toronto. So we're coming to you from KWEn's Advantage in Toronto, and Fuji has decided to grace us with his presence. We've made arrangements. If he doesn't like what I'm saying, he'll throw something on the floor and storm out. So watch for that. It might be entertaining. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeff Luciano. So I'm a real estate broker and an agent here at KWEn's Advantage in Toronto. I've been with KWA for, I'm going to say about 10 years. To my left here is Shauna Farr. Shauna is our operations manager on our team. And some of you also know Shauna because she's also an agent at KW Energy. So we have some different representation here. The idea with what we're going to do today as a boot camp of sorts, we're going to go through some of the more standard forms. I was the broker of record here at KWEn's Advantage for a year, so I had the opportunity to review all sorts of people's deals and to notice both our agents as well as other agents when things were done that sometimes caused problems. So I think that's why I was asked to lead this class. It is intended to be interactive. I'm happy to answer questions. However, what we'll do here is please, if you know how to find the reaction button, if you have a question, just raise your hand, and Shauna will watch and sort of let me know so that we can call you and then answer your question as well. If you put a question in the chat, we'll try and keep on top of that as well so that we make sure we answer questions. So any questions to start with? Are we good to go? Thumbs up if we're good to go. One thumb up. Thank you. It is Marcia, right? Thanks, Marcia. Oh, a bunch of thumbs up. Fuji, give me a thumbs up. 2 thumbs up. Fuji, get out. Come on. Okay.
I still feel the big bracket.
Okay, guys. What we're going to start with here, the first form is the buyer representation agreement. So I'm going to go through this a little bit. The whole point is that I'm going to try and give some tips and tricks and point out some places where people sometimes make mistakes. So this is not intended to be an exhaustive, this is what you put in this line, this is what you put in that line. I think we all were taught that in our various courses, and that's pretty straightforward to find. It's more about where there were some areas that there were some issues. So so let's first off start going through this form. So buyer rep agreement. So I'm going to minimize this so I can see the form fully. And so Shauna, please let me know if people are asking questions, or maybe you can expand this a little bit to see if you can make sure you can see everybody. Okay, so first off, one of the things that people sometimes ask is if you're looking in, this is in web forms, and you see that all of these forms, they have the different versions for all the various real estate boards. So this one, it says on the left-hand side, it's a REA form, the Ontario Real Estate Association. If you pull up the other ones, they're all identical. They just sometimes have a different logo here. So if you're in Durham and you pull up something, it might have the Durham Regional Board logo up there, but otherwise the forms are not different. So don't stress about whether you're using the Ontario or a local one. They are fundamentally the same. So so this buyer representation agreement, so Form 300. One of the first things I guess I point out is that when we look at this section here and buyer, this is where you need to make sure that you're putting in the full legal names of the people that you're dealing with. If you have multiple buyers that you're dealing with, it is important to make sure that you don't just put, like, for example, the husband or the wife's name, or the father but not the mother. You need to be able to make sure that the agreement that you have is actually with the people that you're showing there. On occasion, there have been stories of people who work with buyers, and then it turns out that they only had it under one person's name, and the other person, they decided to buy a property, perhaps even one that had been shown, and the paperwork was not clear on that. So I'll start off with saying that you should make an effort to make sure that you know you have everybody on there, and don't just say, oh, that's fine, I've got one or two. The next thing is this exclusive and irrevocable authority. So one of the questions that people sometimes ask is about how long this should be for. So obviously there's a section down here that says if the time period for the agreement exceeds 6 months, the brokerage has to obtain the buyer's initials. I mean, Fuji, when you do buyer reps, how often do you typically do it for? What length of time?
I'll just for all eternity.
For all eternity. That's why Fuji is here. Do not listen to, no.
No, seriously, I usually do about 3 or 4 months.
Yeah.
But if I know closing is a certain date, like
Yeah.
sometimes I know you're not supposed to do this, but sometimes I'll rush out to a showing. They'll be like, okay, I like it. Let's put together an offer. So sometimes I'll set the expiry date after closing so that I know that if something happens, they're still represented by it.
Okay. I mean, it's an agreement, right? So as long as everybody involved is in agreement with it, it's okay. These can be as short as 1 day. Sometimes people get a little bit nervous about signing a buyer rep. Sometimes the agents get nervous. Sometimes the clients get nervous. And in those cases, I mean, one of the practical, piece of advice I'd give is if someone says, well, we don't really know you, we just started working together, we don't want to sign a lengthy buyer rep, can we just see it without one? You say, why don't we do it this? You can either do it this way, you can either do it for just 1 day, or you can also do it for the specific property. So it is always good to get one of these in play. So it also, even if it's just for 1 day or for it's 1 week, you say, we'll go see a few places. If you don't like it at the end of this, you're not bound to me. Often by the time you're going to see another place and they have to sign one again, you can say, can we put it for a bit longer? And people tend to be more responsive there. So, but in terms of the length of time here, so yeah, you can pick whatever length you want. 3 months is not unusual. The most typical length of time from a purchase, from the date someone actually signs an agreement of purchase and sale and the closing, is typically between 45 to 60 days. So if you put one for a month, for example, well, one, you may not have been able to even find some property within that length of time. And two, to Fuji's point, this buyer's rep may have technically expired. That's not an issue per se, but I'm kind of the same way, Fuji. I like it to go beyond, so that I'm like, no, I'm your buyer rep for the entirety of it. If you sign an agreement of purchase and sale, like that is binding. There's not the same exclusion, so it's not strictly necessary, but it's a useful sort of way of approaching things. I'll pause for a second. Any questions or hands up there so far, Shauna?
Nothing yet.
Good. There's not a peep out there, so I kind of feel like I'm just talking to Fuji and Shauna, but that's okay. They're both good people.
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah.
I just sent a note to Joby, but I have my volume turned up full blast and you're still really soft. And I know you're not really soft.
I am. Thank you. I have been going to the gym. I appreciate that, Deb. I'm gonna close this door, so maybe it'll help a little bit. And I'll also, Shauna, maybe we'll move a bit forward. Sure. So thank you, Deb. Appreciate that.
I had a question about the next part, Jeff.
Yeah, go ahead.
So when you put in, we know what the property type is, but when you put in the area, what do you usually use for geographical location? How specific are you when it gets to that?
So thank you. So Fuji's question, it's a great question, is how specific do you need to be for the geographic location? So this is actually an area where buyer agents sometimes get into trouble because you can put GTA, you can put everywhere, you can leave it blank. And what they've found is basically, if it's ever questioned, and whether this is a RICO issue or it goes to some sort of actual like lawyer claim, the geographic location is important. You need to be specific. Now, how specific is sort of open to interpretation. But if for example, like you're looking, in our neck of the woods, if you're looking in the beaches, say beaches or maybe East York, you can put those specific ones. You might say East End of Toronto. So, but it should not be so unnecessarily broad that it is deemed not to be enforceable, that you say, yeah, well, you weren't actually showing the places in all of Ontario, for example, or all of the GTA. So it's a great question, and it should be specific enough, right? So there's no firm answer to that, but yeah. Think about it that way. If you have clients who are looking in a very specific area, I would get pretty specific about it. If all they're looking for is in Leslieville or South Riverdale, you can put South Riverdale. Keep in mind that this is the buyer representation agreement. If you end up buying a place for them somewhere else, and there's obviously the confirmation of co-op is signed in that case, it's not going to be an issue where you're going to say, well, you don't get your commission because your buyer rep was too restrictive. But it can be the opposite, where if it was ever questioned, if it was too broad a geographic area, it's not going to be deemed as permissible. Okay, next section here is a good one to point out because I feel like they added this, I think, maybe a year or two ago. It wasn't always here to my recollection. So buyer hereby warrants that the buyer is not a party to a representation agreement with any other registered real estate brokerage for the purchase or lease of a real property. So this is them saying, yeah, I don't already have an agent. So this is an important one to get signed. We have had issues, I can recall a couple of times where there was some debate as to whose client this person's actually was. And our agent, who had this section signed, was able to, like in this section, the buyer rep in place and this initial was able to say, no, I asked, and they said they didn't have an agent, and then they initialed that fact. And I think there were 3 brokers of record, myself and 2 others who were talking it out, and the other 2 brokers of record were like, that's pretty clear. You know, they're your client. So do make sure that you get this fully signed. In general, that's one rule, is make sure you've read through these documents, because when you do miss things, it can become a real problem if there's any issue. If there's not an issue, everything is fine, but I don't think we want to do our business as if everything's always going to be hunky-dory. So that's right, I said hunky-dory. I'm just, as I said, I'm not going to go through all of this, but I'm just going to go down. I'll point out one thing here. So you'll see here, initials of brokerage. So obviously, the way that this works is, you'll note here, this is an exclusive buyer rep for purchase or lease between brokerage and buyer. There is no agent name here. Your buyer representation agreements are not with you as an agent, they are with your brokerage, right? So if I sign a listing, a buyer representation agreement, and for some reason I am no longer able to fulfill my duties, or I need to take some time off, and if Fuji is going to represent me, the brokerage has the exclusive buyer rep, not the individual. Okay, so that's important for people to know. And down at the bottom when you're signing, so it's initials of brokerage. I have, on occasion, you get some new agents who are saying things like, oh, so my broker of record signs that. No, you have the right to initial in a few different ways as a representative of the brokerage. So this is where you as an agent would put your initials, but you are representing the brokerage. Top of the next section here is talking about the commission. So this is an interesting one. So a big part of the reasoning behind a buyer rep is obviously if you're doing work for a buyer, you want to get paid. So this here, so paid a commission of, and you're allowed to fill in what the percentages are. So you can fill in what the average is in your area if you like. Entitled to be paid a commission of, so you could put 2.5% of the sale price of the property. Or, and sometimes in that second section there, in the or section, people put or as per the MLS. Right? So if all you have at the top is to be paid a commission of 2.5%, what the buyer is actually saying is if there was a property where they were offering a co-op commission of less than 2.5%, the buyer is responsible for picking up that deficiency. It talks about that below. So it is worth noting that people will often sign these if all it says is a commission of 2.5%, and you end up showing them a place that maybe is a for sale by owner or one of these 1% realty places. You could be in a situation where you could, in theory, go after the buyer. It's worth noting that this exists. It's not just whatever on the MLS is what you get paid. That's true in that it's what you're going to be paid by the listing brokerage, by the co-op side, but it's not that you don't have a right here to go after a potential client. My personal take on this, not as a former broker of record, but I find it difficult. I typically put in there 2.5%, and then I put or as per the MLS listing, because that way I have the conversation with my buyers that they understand that I am not going to come after them, that this is being paid for by the seller. The flip side of that, though, is if I obviously we all have the obligation to show all properties regardless of the commission that's being paid, and if there's a particularly poor commission being offered on one, you do have to then have a conversation with your client because they're not obligated. If the commission on the co-op on the listing says 1.5% and you've put a commission of 2.5 or as per the MLS listing, your buyer has no obligation. Whereas if you just left it at 2.5%, your buyer technically has to pay you that 1%. So it can be a touchy sort of period, a touchy sort of conversation, but I think worth raising here that's the specifics. Any questions about that so far?
I have one, Jeff.
Yeah, go ahead. Luke.
Would it be better to just say 2.5% or to be negotiated, depending on the MLS listing? Or
I think it's better to be specific rather than say to be negotiated.
to be determined by both parties, because let's face it, if the listing says, $1 for cooperative commission rate, because some of these physicals are.
Yep.
That's, if you have on contract 2.5% or as per MLS, then that means you're obligated to show them, do the paperwork, and do all of it for that $1.
Right. Do you want to, Shauna, can you make a note of that? We'll ask we'll ask our lawyer of record. Some of these questions, I think they're good questions, and rather than me hemming and hawing, I think, well, let's see if we can't get an answer from you. So it's specifically is if we had wording that said like in the buyer rep that said to be negotiated or to be determined, like is that going to cause issues? So we'll ask what Mark thinks of that. Next section down here with these dotted lines is the holdover period. So the typical amount that I put in there is 90 days. So I'm just going to read this out because it's often confusing to people. So buyer agrees to pay the broker's such commission if the buyer enters into an agreement within blank days after the expiration of this agreement. That's called the holdover period. To purchase or lease any real property shown or introduced to the buyer from any source whatsoever during the term of this agreement. Provided, however, that if the buyer enters into a new buyer rep with another registered real estate brokerage after the expiration, the buyer's liability to pay commission to brokerage shall be reduced by the amount paid to the other brokerage under the new agreement. So that gets pretty legalese, but I want to be really clear about this. So what this says is if so say I was working with someone and I showed them a place and they liked it, but they weren't sure about it, and then my agreement expired the next day, and they went a month later and bought it directly from the listing agent. They've entered into agreement to see a property that I showed them while our agreement was enforced, and also the holdover period had not expired. If they waited, in this example, if it was 90 days, if they waited 3 months and then did a deal directly, then I wouldn't have any sort of recourse. But if they did it within that period, I would. So 90 days is the most typical. I've seen 180. I've sometimes seen 365. It does get to the point as well where if it goes to whether it's RICO or a court case, the longer it is, the more they say that's not reasonable. I mean, you're entitled to not being taken advantage of. And that's what this is about, right? To prevent buyers from being unscrupulous, hiring you doing all your work, they fire you, it ends, and the next day they go back to the seller and say, hey, now that my agent's out of the way, why don't we cut a better deal? So a bunch of boilerplate stuff here. Schedule. So let's talk about that for a second. So you can include schedules on your buyer rep agreement. They're not often there. We have put in place some at Keller Williams Advantage during COVID. I wrote in conjunction with some lawyers a schedule, Schedule A, that was related to COVID in terms of covering off how we made sure that all of the parties involved, our agents, our buyers, as well as our sellers or our landlords and our tenants, were kept safe. So there was an actual schedule that's still in play here within our brokerage that our brokerage says we want that to be included. So there can be additional schedules. This is nothing to do with a listing agreement like the Schedule B that goes up when you put a listing up online, or the agreement of purchase and sale, the Schedule A that you write out. This is a specific schedule, often Schedule A, but it's for a buyer rep. So just be aware that I'm not sure for Energy and Experience whether that's still in play or whether they put that in play for long. But I know here at Advantage, it is still a requirement that our deals department is looking for. If you don't have any of these, by all means, follow up with your with the admin, and they'll make sure that you've got it. Okay. Declaration of insurance. This is something I often talk about when I'm asking people to sign a buyer rep. As I say, one of the things is I have to be insured, and if there's anything that goes wrong when we're at a showing and we have a buyer rep sign, I have an insurance through my board, or RIA or TREB or whoever it's through. RICA? REBA?
Yeah.
Oh, that's the authority,
Yeah.
right? It has to be from the Real Estate and Business Brokers Act,
Yeah.
but who it's actually through, doesn't matter. So this can be an effective way of saying to someone who's concerned about telling a buyer rep as well, is to say, look, I have to be insured. If anything happened when you were in there, you know, we have some insurance in play. It's not something that is going to cause trouble. And I'm not talking just about like physical issues, but say you take someone who refuses to sign a buyer rep, and then you go through, and then afterwards the seller says somebody stole something, and they say, and you get a claim against you. Well, if you don't have a signed buyer rep, I don't actually know what would happen, but it's not good. Right. So moral of the story is get used to asking people for a buyer representation agreement. Limit the length of time if necessary. If they're not really uncomfortable with it, they don't want it for a long time, you say, that's fine, we'll do it for one day. You can do it for just a specific property if that's the issue. But it's a straightforward document in terms of it's limited for this length of time, but it gives you some significant protection in case anybody does something untoward. And then the acknowledgement. So that is the first one, the buyer rep. Let's stop for a second. Any questions on the buyer rep, people? Any tips or tricks that I know we've got some experienced agents on the call as well as in the room. So if you anybody have any other tips and tricks or recommendations around the buyer rep side of things? Seeing a bunch of no. Okay, cool. All right, let's move on to the next one.
I'll throw one thing in
Oh,
there, actually.
yeah.
Sometimes when I'm going to go showing and it's someone I've never met or I don't know why they're calling with their family like that. Sparse on details, I'll just ask them for a buyer rep for just that house for just that day. And if they don't sign it, I'll just say, okay, thanks, bye.
Yeah.
Because they're probably just wasting my time.
Yeah, it's good. So for those of you, I know we're having, maybe it's not as loud. So Fuji's point is, if he's got someone, whether it's a sign call or from someone he doesn't really know, he'll ask them to do that, to sign a buyer rep. And if they refuse to do so, then he says, that's great, I'm not comfortable showing you, right? And it's totally fair. I mean, it's not just fair. I think it's a safe thing to do. There's the occasional stories of bad things happening to real estate agents. So make sure that you don't just show up at an isolated location by yourself to meet someone who has refused to give you their information. I think it makes a ton of sense to ask those questions and to be professional. Okay. All right. Let's move
I have
on
a question.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Who's there?
Sorry, I missed that part, the geographical location. You know,
Okay.
How can we cover more on that actually? Sorry, I missed that little part.
No problem. And it's Vishal, is it?
Yes.
Hi, Vishal. So yeah, the basics there is it should be, the geographic location should be as specific as possible without being overly limited. So if you should not put, certainly don't put just like your municipality. You know, don't say just put like Toronto, certainly don't say like Durham region, like don't give a region, try and be more specific. It's okay if you want to put a number of different places, like, you know, I have filled out on occasion a number of different areas. We are looking in Richmond Hill, comma, Markham, comma, North, like you can pick specific areas, but the whole idea is that it needs to be representative of where you're actually looking. In theory, you could do a new buyer rep if your search parameters change, because that can happen. So I would start by being more specific and tweak it as you need to go along. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, for example, I was trying to do BRA for a pre-construction, but that was in, for example, Calgary. So we go to write, I mean, we can still write Calgary.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, if that's where the pre-construction project is, yeah, I would write Calgary. I mean, if it's just that pre-construction, and assuming you're not popping out to Calgary all the time, then you could put the actual the location of it. You know, like if it's located in whatever, downtown Calgary. I've been to Calgary. I should know some more places apart from downtown, but yeah.
Okay. All right, I'll try to be more specific, because earlier I used to write region of Peel, I mean, and then region of Durham, because people are looking everywhere.
Yeah, it's just, it can be difficult, Vishal, if you end up getting, if for example, they do end up, they're using another agent, and then this other agent had a more specific one, that tends to go poorly for the agent with the broader location, because they say, well, all right, that's fine. You may have been dealing with them in a number of different areas, but this agent where they actually bought the property, he has a buyer rep for that area. So think of it that way if you ever get into it. There's a question there,
We have a
Shana?
question in the chat. So Nicole is asking, could you simply amend the BRA if the geographic location changes?
I would say yes. The reason I'm pausing is because whenever you make adjustments to agreements, you need to you need to make sure that it's initialed by all parties, and it's the timing side of things, right? So you know what? I'm going to take it back. Nicole, the safest thing to do would be just to do a new BRA. The reason I say that because I could foresee a potential situation where so you add in a different area and they initial it, but they say like the original date of the BRA was earlier. They say when I initialed that we'd actually gone before then and they weren't covering me there. It's clearer if you do a new document. In general, I understand it's a little bit more work, but the easiest way to avoid confusion is to do a new one. So that'd be my advice. Any questions there?
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. All right, let's move on to listing agreement. So this is the fun one when you've got actual property to sell. So one of the first things I'll point out is, so you see at the top here, it's MLS or exclusive, right? So this is the same document for regardless of whether it's going on the multiple listing service or whether it's an exclusive listing. That is the only difference in terms of what's going on here. There are no changes here, which is why they can just put it at the top. Obviously, when it's an MLS, we have the data information form that we need to fill out to do the actual MLS listing, whereas with an exclusive listing, that's not a requirement. But up at the top here, you should not have them initial both, right? It is an or, not an and, right? So if you are doing an exclusive listing and then you are doing an MLS listing as well, you need to have two documents, right? It's one or the other. So just keep that in mind. Certainly within my brokerage, it's not uncommon for us to have an exclusive listing at the beginning, sometimes during the prep stage where agents can start to talk about it, can promote it within the brokerage, within their network of people. And then as we get to the MLS stage to sign an MLS agreement. So that would typically it would look like an exclusive might be, for example, if it was for like a month and a half, the exclusive might go, you can have both in place at the same time. It's not that you only can have one or the other, but you cannot use the same document to set up both. So you can have an exclusive, say, for 6 weeks, and 4 weeks in, you're ready to list on MLS. You can have an MLS the listing that starts, and there's still 2 weeks left on the exclusive. That's not an issue. It's just don't use the same document. So again, I'm not going to go through this every bit. I'll just point out some things that I think are worth knowing. So it's between brokerage, right, and the seller here, not the listing agent, it's the listing brokerage. So make sure you're putting in the right address. That seems pretty obvious, but sometimes people put in the wrong, whether it's a street or an avenue, and that can cause issues because you actually have the right to list that property. Exclusive and irrevocable right to act as the seller's agent commencing at. So again, this is the same sort of thing. If it exceeds 6 months, you have to obtain the seller's initials. So I mentioned before, 45 to 60 days is the most typical closing time frame. So certainly 30 to 60 days. If you ever sign a listing agreement that's a super short time frame, because sometimes there is pressure from sellers who don't want to maybe commit for a length of time. Again, it's just because, so say you have a month long and they're only willing to give you a month to prove that you can sell it or to sell it. If you sell it in 3 weeks, but it's closing 4 weeks after that, it doesn't invalidate anything. It just means you only have this length of time to sell it. So it can, I would certainly push for, we typically do 3 months, right? That's what we put on this listing period, and I rarely have pushback. So I would say 3 months is pretty typical. To offer the property for sale at a price of, so obviously you need to put the specifics in here. Again, just like with the buyer rep, there's a section here that has the seller representing that they're not a party to another listing agreement. So they do not currently have this for sale with somebody else, right? So this is where it's worthwhile. Sometimes people will have an exclusive and the deal, it won't get done and they decide that they'd rather hire you to sell it either in an exclusive or on an MLS. So this is an important thing to make clear because, if multiple people are listing it, it can get very murky in terms of who gets the commission. Speaking of commission, so down here, this is where the commission section is listed. So is there a question?
Yes, Nicole is asking, does MLS have a minimum contract time?
I think you're right. I think I dealt with this. Someone asked me this recently. 60 days. Fuji's saying great. Let's see it on the big board. See, 60 days? No. 60 days sounds right to me. Nicole, yeah, that's my take on it as well. Okay. So the commission side of things. So this is where this is sometimes written wrong. So keep in mind that the way that with most of our deals that we do in Ontario, the way that it works is that the seller pays the listing brokerage, the full commission, and then the listing brokerage pays the co-op commission, the buyer commission to the other side of the deal. So the most typical that we see, it's not mandated obviously, is a commission of 5% of the sale price of the property. And then underneath where it says offer to pay the cooperating brokerage a commission of, and here is where you put 2.5% of the sale price or the property, or 2.5% is what is typically here. If there was a specific dollar amount, it would go here. But this is how that is typically written. So I would often see as a broker of record listing documents that come in at let's say 2.5% of the sale price. And then they said, and 2.5% of the sale price to the co-op. So you say, congratulations, you're listing it for zero. That's technically what that says. And it's not what anybody agreed to, but it is what it says, right? So in those circumstances, it becomes a question. You're like, well, what if we have the confirmation of co-op actually only talks about the co-op side. So there is no other document that actually specifies what you're getting paid here, right? So you need to make sure that it's you don't put 2.5% there. You put the 5%, and then you deduct what is going to the co-op side of things. Otherwise, you would have to go back to your sellers, and we did have this happen on a few occasions. You had to go back to the sellers and say, I made an error, we need to adjust this. And technically, I don't know what would happen. Fortunately, in all cases, the sellers were nice about it and said, oh, no problem. Yeah, no, of course, yeah, that's what we talked about. But in theory, we had paperwork that showed the opposite. So, all right, initials of listing brokerage and of sellers. All of this stuff is pretty boilerplate. It is worth sort of mentioning just because it talks about customer service. So with TRESA, with the new Trust in Real Estate Services Act, they are planning on removing the idea of customer, like client and customer designation. So all of these forms are going to change as a result. So that's happening over the next year and a half, I think, is by the time it'll sort of come to fruition. So all of these forms that we're talking about are going to be tweaked and updated by OREA, because a lot of the terminology is changing, right? So the Real Estate and Business Brokers Act was from 2002, was very outdated. And so we've got a new one, but there's a number of changes that KWEa and OREA, as well as the local boards, pushed for, and this is one of them to sort of get some clarification, because it has been an issue. Deb, did you have a question? No? Okay. All right. Going down here. This section here is not too complicated, but it's worth mentioning if you're a new agent. So in the event this agreement expires or is canceled or otherwise terminated, the property is not sold, the seller by initialing does or does not consent to allow other real estate board members to contact the seller after expiration or other termination of this agreement to discuss listing or otherwise marketing the property. So this is one that I always put my clients does not, and I say, I'm assuming that if for some reason we didn't actually sell your property, you don't want any real estate agent who sees that to be able to call you and ask about maybe relisting with them. And they go, no, I don't want that. Does not is the way to handle that. Schedule is down at the bottom here. So again, this is a listing agreement. So this is not where you need to, you can put Schedule B there, do you? So
Schedule B, yeah.
Schedule B. So this is where the Schedule B for your brokerage needs to be referenced. So Schedule A and B, right? Because
No, it's just the COVID thing.
the COVID one, do we have one still?
Yep.
The COVID one. So, but that's the 8, right? And
That-
B is our.
Sorry, B is
These on the agreement of purchase.
Sorry.
B is our trust voter.
Yeah, B is here.
Yeah.
Right, this B, yeah. So, sorry, we're debating amongst ourselves. So yeah, so Schedule B, so let's talk about Schedule B for a second. So in case people don't know this, so Schedule B is not technically a requirement. The only aspect of Schedule B that is currently required under the Real Estate and Business Brokers Act is the requirement to disclose if the listing brokerage is holding the commission, the deposit, what interest rate is being provided. So it's
Sorry, that's only on the real purchase sale then. It doesn't talk
but
about.
this is the listing agreement that we were giving the authority to upload it, right?
Right. But the Schedule B is on the real purchase sale, it's not, because it says to be attached on the real purchase sale.
They have to, but that's the buyer side of things. But if we're on the listing side, we have to say this is our Schedule B, which is being part of what we're uploading.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is new.
Okay, good. So where I was going with that is the Schedule B has the only component that's actually technically required is that interest component on any deposit. So almost all brokerages have a Schedule B, and they've almost all thrown other things on there. Often they're cover your butt stuff in terms of that they do not warrant the information is accurate, like the measurements. There might be things nowadays about digital signatures and so forth, but the only aspect that's actually required on a Schedule B is the bit about the interest on deposits. I have seen a few places where they do not have a Schedule B, and that's because they require people to mention it in their Schedule A. But make no mistake, it does have to be somewhere in any offer that's submitted, any agreement of purchase and sale, and the listing has to have the specifics of the deposit interest levels, which is 0. Okay. Authorized to sign to bind the listing brokerage. So this is where you as an agent can sign. This does not have to be signed by your broker of record. And then the signature of the seller. But again, to be clear here, authorized to bind the listing brokerage, name of person selling. So this is where you as a listing agent, your name goes on here, but you are not listing the property. Your brokerage is listing the property. You just have the authority to bind the listing brokerage to accept this listing. Final section here that's worth talking about is the spousal consent. So undersigned spouse of the seller hereby consents to the listing of the property herein pursuant to the provisions of family law, hereby agrees to execute all necessary incidental documents for further blah, blah, blah. So what this means is this does not need to be signed if both spouses are on title. But this does need to be signed if there is a marital situation, which is in common law applies here as well. Which is, I'm going to say a year, but if anybody knows differently, please speak up.
It might be less than that now, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Basically, if it is a marital home from people, even if they're not married, but they're residing in it together as a couple, I would, and one of the spouses is not on title, I would have them added onto this and they sign here. This is to prevent obviously that. So say there's a breakup and one of them is deciding to sell the house and you're like, well, you're the only one on title, so everything is hunky-dory. This needs to be approved by the spouse, even if they're not on title. Otherwise, it can certainly get into some issues. Any questions? No. Declaration of insurance, acknowledgement is straightforward, and that is the listing agreement. Any questions about that before we move on to another one?
Jeff, sorry, I think I may have missed it, but if the spouse is on title,
Mhm.
they don't
Then
have to.
they don't, because their name is up at the top here under seller. It would be name and name, right? So it's only if they're not on title, but they do have a right to the property.
Okay, I heard you say even if, and so it made me wonder if you thought
No.
they should be. Okay, thanks.
Thank you for clarifying. Okay,
I have a quick question, Jeff.
yeah, sure, go ahead. Is that Judy or Jen?
Yeah, it's Judy.
Hi, Judy.
Hi. So if you have a exclusive listing signed and then you're switching over to MLS, do you have to get a release for the exclusive listing if it's longer, if it's dated longer than when you then sign the MLS listing?
No, you don't. You can have two concurrent ones. You do need a new document. So it's fine to have an exclusive listing. You're not likely to do anything with that exclusive listing, but no, you don't need to have it terminated.
Okay.
Like this is, yeah, in a sense, the MLS listing will supersede it,
Supersede it,
because,
okay.
I mean, in theory, I mean, it gets murky, right? It's all about where they actually saw the property, right? So if say you sent out an email to a database, and like three days after your MLS listing comes up, someone from that email from the database says, "Oh, I saw your email finally. I am interested in seeing it." It's kind of irrelevant. You have the MLS listing as well, but technically, that would have come through the exclusive. So I guess the only time it becomes relevant is if you have differences in commission. If you say on the exclusive, I'll do it at this price, whereas on the MLS, I'll do it at a different one. I could see that then you'd have some arguments about which one is in force.
Or the price of the property too, because that might change as well, right?
Right, but I mean, what you're listing it at is I mean, it could, whether they get that or they get higher or lower, that's more the agreement of purchase and sale, whether they'll agree to it. So as long as it's clear on how you represented it. So if you said yes, it's 1.4 on this exclusive, but then when you go to MLS, you decide to list at 1.3 because everyone said that was too high. If someone comes to you at from the exclusive, it's irrelevant because it's got to do with the eventual sale price on the agreement of purchase and sale.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
We have a question from Nicole, and then Ed has also raised his
Okay.
hand.
Can you tell me the question from Nicole?
Still confused about Schedule B. Why does that have to be included in the listing agreement if it's included in the APS?
Okay. Thank you, Nicole.
And I just pulled it up too. If you want to see it, it says like the buyer section on it, or it says buyer's name section, so it can't be on the listing agreement because we don't have those things yet.
No, but you uploaded as part of your listing, like you uploaded to the MLS.
Sure you do, but
blank.
that doesn't need to be included as the listing agreement. The seller will see that when the sign the purchase and sale. It's not to be part of the listing agreement.
So, but it
That's
needs,
what I thought.
yeah. That's in it. You might be right, Fuji. This is why we have classes like this. We can have these debates. So the question that Nicole had asked was she's confused about when it's required. So let's go through this, and we'll get to it in a bit when we talk about the agreement of purchase and sale. But if you're on the listing side, so when you upload your listing to MLS, and you have you put up various documents, you put your floor plans, you put any sort of pictures and so forth, and that's where you also put your brokerage's Schedule B. So the question is it necessary to have in a listing agreement at the bottom there that you're referencing the Schedule B? Fuji's point is it's not filled out because there's a section that's the listing and the buying. I think it's required because what we're saying is this is what we're putting up there as part of our listing agreement. Because to be clear, with an MLS listing, we also have the data information sheet, which we have them initial and sign because that's all the specifics. We're saying this is what we're putting up there. So
I don't have the floor plans or the photos, those aren't signed initially, right? And they're also part of the deal. You're signed condo, you have floor
But
plan.
they don't ever get signed.
yeah, no. All right. We are going to get clarification, but not today. Thank you, Fuji. So thank you, Nicole. We'll figure that out. It's not putting it on there is not going to. If you have it on here, we'll see whether the deals department agree with that.
Yeah.
But us, whether that's an issue. But we'll find out, and we're going to send something out to the group afterwards anyway. So we'll get clarification on that. Ed, you had a question as well.
Yeah, and then Jen, yeah.
Did he?
Yeah, I have two questions, actually.
Okay, go ahead, Ed.
I have two questions. First question is, I've never had this scenario, but just in the event that it does come up, because I'm sure it will. So I'm listing a property, let's say, hypothetically, and the guy says, I have an ex-wife. So so I would put obviously in seller. Now, would he go in spouse or in the listing agreement, or do we not put do we not put the ex in the listing agreement at all? How does
Okay,
that
so
work?
if I'm understanding correctly, so the listing agreement, so if the X is on title, you need
Not
them
on
to
title.
sign. Not on title.
Yeah.
But has a right to the marital home. I don't know if it's an actual ex-wife. If that's more of a lawyer question, because I don't think in this case that you have to do anything if it's an ex-wife. If they are divorcing, if we're separated and this has not yet been resolved, then I would suggest then you do need spousal consent. Otherwise, it could get hung up at that point where they say, well, I never agreed, and I think this is an asset that you're selling to someone like all sorts of shenanigans.
Yeah, I almost had a situation like that, but it never, it all worked out.
It's a question, and by the way, guys, I should have said this at the beginning. So, not a broker of record, not a lawyer. You guys are not lawyers either, unless maybe some of you are as well. I'm not sure. But if you're acting as a real estate agent, know when to say, that's a great question. You need to ask your lawyer. So from us speaking here, if it's an ex-wife, do you need to have them as spousal consent? I would say no. If it is anything other than that, if a divorce is in progress or they're currently separated, then you say, if this was a marital home that they were living in together, then this should be signed by them. And if they balk at that, you say, okay, let's talk to our lawyer, talk to your lawyer and see if they agree. We're trying to head off problems.
Right. Okay. Question
Second
number
question
two.
then? Yep.
Yeah. Question number two. So if I need to approach my seller with a price adjustment, do I have to come up with a whole new MLS listing agreement, or can I just go up and change the price up online?
No, you need an amendment.
I need an amendment.
You need an amendment, right? So it's an amendment. The form is an amendment to the listing agreement. So you don't need a brand new listing agreement, but you do need an amendment that specifies it, right? And the reason for that, people get into trouble if they start making changes on here, is because particularly if it's handwritten, but they say, well, we can't tell which one, when this took place. We can't, like, there's no date attached to it, whereas an amendment has the specifics of it. It's signed by these people on this date as of this date. So you always need to do an amendment if you're making any change to the price.
Of course.
Price.
Thank you.
Okay, no worries. Okay, I'm gonna move through this quickly because we're running out of time and I want to share a couple of things. Oh yeah, sorry, Jen, did you have another question, or Jen, you have a question?
Yeah. I just have a quick question. Do you add onto a schedule, if we're paying now for staging and painting and maybe some repairs, are you adding a schedule that in the event that they decide not to sell, that we would be reimbursed for those? Should that be added as a schedule?
I think that's a great idea. I've heard a number of agents talk about doing that. Mike Clark was talking about that on our Tuesday tour. He's done it in the past and maybe he's reconsidering it. So I've definitely seen it. Yeah, something that specifies exactly what's going to happen in terms of if they choose to not sell or they don't receive an offer that they're comfortable with, that is payable typically with a time frame as well, like was paid back within this time frame. So it's not necessarily that easy, but as my friends who are lawyers tell me, there's the law and then there's what people think is the law. So if you have that in writing in a schedule to your listing agreement, the chance of them saying, right, I guess I do have to pay that because I decided this isn't enough money, is better, not 100%, but it's better than if you didn't have that and you go, well, I'm out of pocket, and they go, well, that's tough on you. Isn't that a risk you take? So yes, I would definitely say it's a good idea, Jen. Okay.
Thank you for that. Oh, sorry. There's one other little thing. HST is on top of the commission. And I remember, my early days as realtor, I guess didn't explain that to my seller and they forgot about it. It can be a substantial amount of money. So I always put 5% plus HST and kind of bring that to their attention because it's not really outlined in it, and it can be a huge addition onto the commission they pay.
That's a great tip. It can't hurt. Yeah, I mean, it does. It's a plus applicable taxes, so it is there. But yeah, I've often seen it plus HST, and it's, again, if we can get ahead of a problem and they go, oh, I didn't know HST was applicable. You're like, yep. Remember we talked about it here, or you can see it's right here. And they're like, okay, good, because you're right. It's not crystal clear. I mean, it is crystal clear, but there's a bunch of things on here, and people are notoriously poor at reading contracts. Awesome, great tip. Thanks, Jen. Okay. Agreement of purchase and sale. So this is the big one. Obviously, this is where the rubber hits the road. You've either got a buyer, you got a seller, and you're getting a deal done. So most of this is pretty straightforward. Legal description. I mean, I'll make a recommendation here. You can look on any property. Don't just paste in what the listing agent has. If you're writing on the buyer side, and if you're on the listing side, make sure that they put the right thing. Check on property line. You can click on that very easily. You can get the legal description so that you're not sort of caught unaware if they use the wrong thing, the wrong legal description. So purchase price, straightforward. Deposit, so this is one sometimes people get confused by. So herewith means a deposit check, bank draft or a check has been prepared. Now in COVID days and recently, that's gone from here, you got it and I can show it to you, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer or Mr. and Mrs. Seller, to sending a picture of it. But if you already have the deposit check, bank draft, it's herewith. If you're going to get it, it's upon acceptance. So if you're acting on behalf of a buyer and they say, yeah, I've got it, you say, great, send me a picture so that I can, one, I know that if I say herewith, it actually is, and two, that I can prove to them. Upon acceptance is, as it says down here, this is within 24 hours. This is sometimes agents often get this wrong, where they're like, okay, we did a deal on Friday, I'll get that to you on Monday. And you're like, whoa. It says within 24 hours. So technically speaking, if your client and you're like, oh, my clients are at the cottage, they're going to get it to you on Monday, what's the big deal? You should not say upon acceptance, because you're obligated to have it within 24 hours. If that is the case, you should say as otherwise described in this agreement. And in Schedule A, you say, rather than, that's where you say the buyer agrees to provide the deposit on Monday, blah, 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 right? So here's where buyer agrees to pay the balance. Schedules that attach form part of this agreement. So Schedule A is always included as part of this. That's whoever is submitting this on behalf of the buyer has the opportunity to write the Schedule A. If you're using, obviously, if this is for a landlord-tenant situation, Schedule A is often provided by the landlord side. But for on a buy side, Schedule A is written by the buyer's agent, and then comma B is what goes in here, because almost all brokerages will have a Schedule B, as we talked about. Irrevocability date. So this is, again, sometimes people have issues with this or run into problems. So if you're going back and forth, you need to make sure these are being changed, right? So it starts off, offer shall be irrevocable by the buyer until whatever time, 11:59 p.m. on the, and then you put in the date, after which time, if not accepted, offer shall be null and void. So if you're doing sign backs back and forth, you got to cross out, it was irrevocable by the buyer. The seller says, nope, I want to change it. You can keep the same time. So say someone says 11:59 and at 9 p.m. your seller says, no, I don't like that. I want more money, and I make a change. You cross out the bit that said buyer and you put seller and have your client initial it, but you can keep the date and time the same if they're still relevant. But if they're changing, you need to also have them initial that. Completion date is when the actual closing date is. My brother's a lawyer, and he pointed out something that was interesting recently. So this agreement, it says here, like how late? No later than 6 p.m. But what's interesting is that often deals can't close past 5. Right, so this terminology is actually difficult for lawyers, because they're like, I think the land registry closed, depending on where the location is, the land registry is often closed at 5. So if they get funding at 4:55 and they cannot get it done in time. So 6 p.m. is the date here. That's the expectation. From a practical perspective, whenever I talk with buyers and they say, so we're closing, when should we get the keys? I say, don't book your movers for that day. You should expect to get them probably, if everything goes well, by sometime in the early to mid-afternoon. Do not count on in the morning. Do not book movers on that day, because there can be delays, particularly if it's a complicated deal where there's multiple mortgages on either side. Anything that involves financial institutions can slow things down in terms of all of the parties being satisfied that it can go forward. Notices. This often you can see. Yeah, go ahead.
All right, I've got one question going back to the deposit. Can you, if that's not given within 24 hours or within the time that's specified, is that technically make the APS null and void, or it doesn't because that's technically not a condition?
It's a very complicated question, Nicole. The short answer, from my understanding, again, not a lawyer, is that it doesn't automatically make it null and void. You should certainly, like buyers who think that just because they didn't provide the deposit, they can now walk away. That is not the case. That is a more detailed question that I think maybe we'll see if on one of our next meetings, we can get our lawyer of record to speak to it, because I'm not qualified and it's a complicated answer.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Okay. Next, I'm going to go through here. So chattels and fixtures. So this is a good opportunity. This is where people often put the chattels included, and they just go off of the list that's in the MLS listing. That's a good starting point, but you should also make sure that you specify anything else. So make sure if it doesn't say barbecue in the listing, but your client quite liked the barbecue and you were told it was included, you need to reference it here. If you don't, you're not going to be able to say that it was part of it. Fixtures excluded. Similarly, if someone says the mirror in this hallway is excluded, or this chandelier, you need to write these specifics. Rental items, again, you often see hot water tank brackets if rental. It's much better to have the specifics. So you should, if you're listing a property, you should ask your client and get the specifics in terms of how much it is, and also if there's a contract, when it expires. And if you're buying, you should ask that question, because it's better that people know. There have been some bad examples of much higher than expected costs for rental items. And it comes back to the agents there. They say, well, you guys should have been clear about that. HST, so if you're dealing with a resale property, then HST is not applicable. That's a broad answer. The specific answer is there are a couple of things that in theory it should be applicable to, but in general for resale properties, we're going to say that it's not applicable. So whether it says included in or in addition to is irrelevant. Almost always on the buy side, we put included in, and sometimes listing agents say, no, that's not right, because we're not, HST is in addition to. You say, well, there is no HST, but okay. So it is a point of confusion. It says here, any HST on chattels, if applicable, is not included. I've never seen that in my career, that people actually go back on it, but in theory, that's what I mean when I said specifically there are some differences. Title search. So this is typically what I learned when I took my course was between 10 to 14 days. I'll often put 2 weeks before. This is an important date only because the lawyer on the buyer side has to, by this date, have requested the title to the property. Technically speaking, if the lawyer does not do it by then, if there's a problem with what's on there, your buyer is out of luck. So it often happens, it's outside of our purview, but make sure that you give enough time, because 10 to 14 days is certainly useful. Present use. So typically I don't get super specific here. I'll put residential. Sometimes residential single family home. If you're concerned about something like as to whether it's a triplex that in fact can be continued as a triplex, put triplex in there, right? So, but it's present use. You should make sure that you're clear on what it is and put that in there. We're almost out of time, guys, and I did want to share something that was, I think, useful. So I'm just gonna skip down here, see if there's anything particularly important. Commission trust, that's good. Schedule A, this is where obviously we put in, if you're on the buy side, this is where you put in the things to protect your buyer. There are some defaults here. Every agent sort of starts to develop what they like to put in here to protect their buyer. These are the clauses that we learned in school, so they're quite standard. I'll send this link out, but on our website, if it is loading, there's a couple of ones here under this URL. A couple of specific clauses that I've developed over the years. So I'll go through them really briefly. So one is an adjustment to closing date. If, for example, you wanted to have the ability to move the completion date either forward or backwards, this is some wording that will allow that to happen, so that you can give some flexibility. Sometimes that can be important if you're on the buy side and the sellers are not sure about when they want to move, or they're not sure exactly when would be the best date, and your buyer clients don't care or don't particularly care. This can be a valuable thing to add in, because it allows the sellers to give them some leeway, because you can change it to the seller may advance or push, etc. Credit upon closing. If there is a credit upon closing that is agreed upon, this would be some wording for that. This was a more complicated one, this completion of work guarantee and holdback. That's if there's something going on. This is a specific example, but I included the wording just as to say what would happen if we haven't done it by X or we haven't done it by Y. Condition of property upon closing. This is a helpful one in a tight market if you want to be a very appealing buyer. Buyer agrees the seller may leave any and all furniture and items behind at the property upon closing that they do not wish to take with them. So this can be helpful if you've got sellers who are not particularly keen or interested in cleaning up the property, and for the cost of a junk disposal, you can make yourself feel more appealing. Square footage. This is one more on condos, but often the MLS listing square footage differs from if you pull the actual residential floor area report. So this can be something that says you acknowledge that the lower sale is based on the lower of the two. Again, this is a way to try and position yourself as removing a worry from the minds of the sellers and making yourself more appealing as a buyer. Recent renovations that it's been done with qualified contractors, etc. No outstanding permits, work orders, or notices of deficiency. So those are just some clauses that we've come up. You're welcome to use them. And I will stop there. And Jen, you have a question.
Yeah, hi. I'm wondering if there is a clause that you would recommend if your buyer is purchasing a home that has a tenant in it, and you would like the home to be vacant. I know of a story of someone who did purchase and they were going to move in, but the tenant refused to move out, and there was ended up in a lawsuit. But if there's something to protect your buyer, if there are disgruntled tenants.
Yeah, protect is a strong word, but perhaps being helpful. There's a number of terminology, a number of clauses related to taking on a property in terms of like everything from the current rental rates. Like all of this can be included as a clause in there, or it can be a separate schedule. So I don't have it specifically offhand, Jen. We'll see if we can find something and put it up onto this page as well, because I know we've certainly had it, but it's quite lengthy, covering off the different eventualities. And again, that would be something that if you're in that situation, you should have your buyer's lawyer vet that and to perhaps make some changes, because you can require all sorts of things, from vacant possession to that they've given the N12 form. You can require all sorts of things, and it still can end up with being an issue. You might want to include, at that point, the lawyer might say there's a clause that says if the tenants haven't moved out 2 days before closing, that closing is extended. There's different ways of handling it, but it's certainly, it is risky, and if they don't want the tenants there, it's very important that you cover yourself off to the best of your ability. Okay, guys, we've gone a couple minutes over. That was an awful lot of talking on my behalf. Some great questions. No good questions from Fuji, but there were a couple of good questions from him.
I have a PSA. If you're gonna list a condo, for the love of God, pay the $5 to get the impact square footage number. Okay, just do yourself a favor.
I love that Fuji said. So if you're gonna list a condo, when people are like, I don't know how big this unit is, you're like, oh my God, you can on Property Line, you can buy the residential floor area report that says specifically what it is. It comes from the builder originally, but it's a way of saying, oh, this is what the square footage is, because people get in trouble all the time misrepresenting the size of a condo, because they're like, no, I was relying on this my client's memory. He said it's about 8,000 square feet, and you go, that seems high. Okay, guys, thank you everyone for attending. I don't know if there are more questions. Everybody's saying
no questions. Patrick says you're awesome.
Thank you,
I don't know if
Patrick.
that's relevant or not.
I think it's accurate.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Thanks for attending.